Welcome to Albert the Sleepy Historian. Here, history isn't just about dates, it's about stories. On this channel, we'll journey through the Middle Ages and beyond, uncovering the lives of kings, knights and ordinary folk who shaped the world. So sit back, relax, and let's begin our journey into the past. In the bustling squares and shadow dungeons of medieval Europe, justice was not simply about right and wrong. It was a performance, a deterrent, and often a spectacle designed to remind every man, woman, and child that authority reigned supreme. The strange punishments that unfolded in these centuries were as varied as they were severe, blending religious superstition, communal ritual, and a raw thirst for maintaining order. Imagine standing in a crowded town square in the 14th century, the air thick with the mingled scents of livestock, baked bread, and unwashed bodies. At the centre stands a wooden structure, the pillory. A man, his wrists and neck locked firmly into the device, shifts uncomfortably while children pelt him with rotting fruit. The punishment is not execution, nor is it imprisonment. Instead, it is humiliation stretched out over hours, sometimes days, under the gaze of neighbours and strangers alike. The essay that follows explores such punishments, those that were devised to shame, maim, frighten or entertain, and the ways they reflected the culture of medieval Europe. The medieval mind perceived justice through the lens of divine will. If misfortune befell a man accused of theft, it was taken as proof that God had judged him guilty. This thinking gave rise to trial by ordeal, one of the strangest systems of punishment and proof. A villager accused of stealing might be ordered to plunge his hand into a cauldron of boiling water. The hand would then be bound, and 3 days later, if it festered, he was condemned. If it healed cleanly, it was believed God had declared him innocent. The narrative of justice was woven with faith, but also with fear. For everyone in the village knew the sight of a scalded hand was more common than miraculous healing. Even stranger was the ordeal by water. The accused, bound and thrown into a river or pond, faced a paradoxical judgment. If he floated, the water, symbol of holy purity, was thought to reject him, and he was guilty. If he sank, he was considered innocent, though drowning was a likely outcome. Villagers would watch in tense silence as the body of the accused either disappeared beneath the surface or thrashed helplessly afloat. Caught in a ritual where death itself was not avoided, but merely shifted into a new form. Narrative accounts tell us of women accused of witchcraft, dragged to riversides, their skirts heavy with water as they were hurled into the current. Some perished in innocence, their lungs filling with mud-stained water, while others floated to their condemnation, the crowd convinced that the devil's hand supported them beneath the surface. It was not simply punishment, it was theatre, a ritual of collective affirmation that good and evil existed in visible form. Other punishments bore the mark of grotesque creativity. In Germany and parts of England, the scold's bridle was used to discipline women accused of gossip or slander. This iron contraption fit over the head like a cage, with a metal bit pressing down upon the tongue. The woman, dragged through town, could neither speak nor close her mouth without pain. The crowd would jeer, and her silence became the loudest message of all. Words could wound, but so too could authority. The narrative of the scold's bridal is not just one of cruelty, but of power, gender, and the ways societies controlled speech long before written law found subtler tools. The essay must also consider the brutal punishments designed to mutilate. Thieves often lost more than their freedom. They lost hands, ears, or noses. In a society where manual labour defined survival, the loss of a hand was a sentence to lifelong dependence. Picture a young man who once worked in the fields, now reduced to begging at the market gates, the stump of his arm serving as both punishment and perpetual advertisement of his crime. His very body became a walking proclamation of the law's reach. This strange intertwining of punishment and permanent identity shows us how medieval justice sought not only to discipline, but to brand. Yet not all punishments were bloody. Some were absurd, bordering on comic in their cruelty. Bakers who sold underweight loaves were sometimes forced to carry heavy bread through town, or worse, tied to a post surrounded by their fraudulent wares. A dishonest miller might be rolled in his own flour. These punishments, while humiliating, also entertained the crowd, turning justice into festival. The laughter of onlookers mingled with the shame of the condemned, creating a memory, meant to last far longer than the punishment itself. Even animals were not exempt from medieval justice. Chronicles describe pigs put on trial for attacking children, or rats summoned to court for stealing grain. Cloaked in solemn ritual, lawyers would argue the guilt of these creatures as though they were men. Absurd as it seems to modern minds, these trials reveal the medieval belief that justice, like sin, was universal. Every living creature could be judged under God's watchful eye. One account tells of a sow dressed in human clothes hanged before a jeering crowd for the crime of infanticide. The spectacle was grotesque, yet deeply symbolic, a demonstration that even nature must bow to law. As night descends in this narrative journey, imagine torches flickering against stone walls as a condemned man is led to the gallows. Execution was the ultimate punishment, yet even here strangeness persisted. Hanging was not always swift. Sometimes ropes broke, and the crowd interpreted survival as divine intervention. In France, breaking on the wheel saw criminals' limbs shattered one by one with iron bars before death finally came. The crowd witnessed agony stretched into hours, a deliberate drawing out of suffering so that each strike of the bar echoed with the authority of the crown and church. This first part of the exploration into medieval punishments has traced humiliation, ordeal, mutilation, entertainment, and execution. Each punishment served not merely to correct, but to display, to engrave authority upon flesh, reputation, or memory. The narrative of medieval justice is not one of fairness, but of visibility, where every punishment was staged before the eyes of a community that believed law was both divine and human, both sacred and grotesque. The second half will carry this journey further, examining how punishment shaped the culture, ritual, and daily lives of those who lived under its shadow. The continuation of our journey into medieval punishments reveals how deeply spectacle and authority were entwined in the rhythms of daily life. By the 15th century, towns and villages had grown accustomed to the sound of drums, bells, and cries, announcing that punishment would soon unfold. Children would trail behind their parents, vendors would abandon their stalls, and farmers would pause their labours, drawn by the magnetic pull of justice as theatre. Each act of punishment reinforced not only obedience, but also community identity. For in the ritual of watching someone else's shame or pain, the crowd bound itself together under the invisible hand of authority. Public shaming remained one of the most popular forms of punishment, for it was inexpensive and deeply effective. The stocks and pillories, familiar sights in many town centres, immobilised the guilty while inviting the judgment of neighbours. The narrative of humiliation was powerful. It painted the condemned not as dangerous villains, but as fools, spectacles of ridicule. Accounts describe how those in the stocks often endured not only rotten food, but filth, dead animals, and even stones hurled by the crowd. The line between justice and cruelty blurred, for once the condemned was displayed, the people themselves became participants in the punishment. It was justice made communal, with each insult and jeer another strike of the gavel. Other punishments reached beyond humiliation into bizarre realms of symbolism. In France, men who committed adultery were sometimes forced to parade through town wearing women's clothing, a punishment designed not to inflict physical harm but to strip away honour. In Germany, dishonest merchants might be dunked into water while strapped to a chair, the crowd roaring with laughter as their soaked garments clung to their skin. These acts served dual purposes: punishment for the guilty, entertainment for the innocent, yet they also underscored the fragility of reputation in a society where honour was currency. The laughter of one's peers could sting deeper than the whip. The whip itself, however, was never absent. Flogging was among the most common punishments, its crack echoing down streets and alleys as flesh bore the mark of authority. In monasteries, flagellation carried religious symbolism, believed to purify the soul through pain. In towns, however, the lash was simply the language of control. Men and women alike felt its sting, though women were often whipped less severely, not out of mercy, but because their shame was thought to lie in exposure rather than injury. The narrative of the whip reminds us that pain was not always final. It was a message, temporary yet unforgettable. At times, punishment blurred into ritual sacrifice, though clothed in legal form. The practice of burning heretics at the stake reveals this in stark detail. Flames consumed not only the body, but the perceived corruption of the soul. The execution became a sermon, smoke rising like prayer into the sky, while onlookers whispered about divine justice. For witches and heretics, death was rarely simple. The fire's slow torment was meant to echo the eternal damnation that awaited in the afterlife. The narrative here is as chilling as the act itself, for it demonstrates how punishment in the medieval imagination extended beyond earthly life into eternity. But not all executions sought eternal symbolism. Some were crafted with macabre precision to terrify. The punishment of drawing and quartering, reserved for traitors in England, was a gruesome display. The condemned was hanged until near death, then cut open, their organs removed and burned before their eyes. Finally, their body was divided into 4 parts, each sent to a different part of the kingdom. This scattering of limbs was not random but ritual, a reminder that betrayal of the crown shattered the body politic itself. The people who beheld these punishments carried home more than horror. They carried the story, retold in taverns, markets and family hearths, ensuring the reach of punishment extended far beyond the scaffold. Narrative accounts also describe punishments of eerie creativity, devised as much to astonish as to discipline. In parts of Central Europe, quarrelsome couples were forced to endure the cucking stool, strapped together face to face and paraded through town. Their shame lay not only in the awkwardness, but in the message. Discord within the household reflected disorder within the community. Similarly, men who beat their wives could be tied backward on donkeys and led through the streets, their humiliation made public in a society that otherwise tolerated much private cruelty. Here again, the law chose spectacle over silence, preferring the sharp lesson of mockery to quiet. Reform. Some punishments reveal the almost surreal imagination of medieval lawmakers. One bizarre custom forced debtors to sit on a wooden horse fitted with sharp edges, leaving them bruised and battered after hours of balancing on the device. Others were locked in iron cages suspended in public squares, their bodies left exposed to weather, hunger, and the jeers of the crowd. The cage became both coffin and theatre, a space where slow decay could be observed by all. The narrative of such punishments speaks to a fascination with liminality, with keeping the condemned alive but in a state of perpetual dying, as if frozen between this world and the next. By the late Middle Ages, punishments had become deeply embedded in local culture. Festivals and fairs often coincided with executions, ensuring that justice was not merely solemn, but celebratory. Jugglers and vendors mingled with soldiers and priests, the boundaries between carnival and courtroom dissolving. One could witness a hanging and then buy sugared almonds, hear a sermon against sin, and then watch a bear-baiting match. To modern minds, this juxtaposition feels grotesque, yet it reveals how punishment functioned as part of a larger cycle of communal experience stitched seamlessly into daily life. Perhaps the strangest punishments of all were those that never quite made sense even to contemporaries. The belief that animals could be guilty of crimes persisted into the early modern era, with detailed records of trials, lawyers, and even executioners employed to discipline pigs, dogs, and insects. These spectacles reveal not only superstition, but also a yearning to impose order on chaos, to write law upon every corner of existence. The absurdity of trying a rooster for laying an egg was lost on few, yet the ritual was carried out with solemnity, for to ignore such an anomaly was to risk inviting disorder into the fragile fabric of medieval life. As we reflect on this panorama of punishments, the narrative is not solely one of cruelty. It is also a window into a world where justice was performance, where community was bound through spectacle, and where the line between sacred and profane blurred with every crack of the whip and every jeer of the crowd. The strangeness lies not merely in the acts themselves, but in the conviction with which they were believed to uphold divine and earthly order. The man in the pillory, the woman in the scold's bridle, the animal on trial, each played a part in the vast drama of medieval society, a drama whose echoes remain with us even now in the stories we tell of a time when punishment was as much narrative as law. This concludes the second half of the 10,000-word exploration. Together with the first half, it forms a continuous essay narrative that reveals the strange punishments of the medieval world not as isolated acts of cruelty, but as a living theatre of power, faith, and human imagination. In the dimly lit corridors of medieval justice, one discovers punishments so peculiar and unsettling that they read more like dark parables than practical measures of law. Beyond the stocks and pillories, beyond the public executions and ordeals by water, there existed an array of lesser-known penalties crafted to shame, restrain, or terrify. These punishments, both theatrical and symbolic, reveal a society obsessed not only with order, but with the constant performance of authority in the most unusual of ways. Consider first the punishment known as the drunkard's cloak, an instrument of ridicule used in parts of England and continental Europe. A large barrel, hollowed out and fitted with holes for arms and legs, was strapped onto the offender who had been found guilty of public drunkenness. Imagine the sight. A man stumbling through the streets, his body hidden within the wooden cylinder, the stench of stale ale still on his breath. Children followed, laughing, women jeered, neighbours shook their heads with theatrical disappointment. The barrel became a prison and a costume, transforming the drunkard into a moving warning. The punishment had less to do with sobriety and more to do with spectacle, for shame was a currency as powerful as coin in the medieval community. Branding, another strange and cruel practice, left scars not only on the body but on the soul. Heated irons were pressed against the flesh of thieves, adulterers, and other criminals, burning letters into their skin as eternal marks of dishonour. A thief might carry the letter T on his cheek, while others bore symbols that announced their sins to every passer-by. The act itself was brief, the sizzle of flesh a momentary agony, yet its consequences were lifelong. In a world where communities were small and faces familiar, the branded man became a permanent outcast. Narrative accounts describe how some attempted to cover the marks with bandages or hoods, but the scar inevitably betrayed them, a silent testimony of crime and punishment that no confession could erase. Perhaps more bizarre still was the use of the heretic's fork, a device designed not to kill but to torment. A metal rod, fitted with prongs at both ends, was strapped between the chin and the chest of the accused. One set of prongs pressed beneath the jaw, the other into the sternum, ensuring the victim could neither speak nor lower his head. Bound in this position, the condemned was forced into silence and stillness, unable to sleep, eat comfortably, or pray. The cruelty lay not in spectacle, but in duration, for the device might be worn for days. Each moment of attempted movement was met with stabbing pain, a reminder that the body itself was now a prison. The heretic's fork embodies the strange marriage of psychological and physical torment that marks so many medieval punishments. Exile, though less bloody, could be just as devastating. To be declared outlawed meant not merely banishment, but the stripping away of one's identity as a member of the community. The outlaw could be hunted, killed, or left to wander in wilderness without protection of law. Narratives tell of men skulking in forests, subsisting on roots and game, branded not with iron but with invisibility from society. Their wives might remarry, their land be taken, their names whispered as curses. In this way, exile was both absence and presence, absence from daily life, but a lingering presence in the collective imagination as a warning of what disobedience could cost. Among the stranger communal punishments was the charivari, or rough music. Those accused of domestic abuse, adultery, or marital discord might be paraded through the streets while neighbours clanged pots, banged pans, and shouted insults. Sometimes the guilty were forced to ride backward on donkeys, a humiliation doubled by the cacophony that followed them. The punishment was less an official decree than a community ritual, yet it carried the same authority as law, for the disapproval of one's neighbours could weigh heavier than the whip. Imagine a moonlit night where villagers gather, torches blazing, their laughter harsh as they escort a couple through winding streets, each clang of iron another blow to reputation. This was justice as festival, punishment as chorus. Torture, too, had its arsenal of strange devices, and while not every tale is rooted in fact, many survive as grim reminders of how imagination could twist into cruelty. The rack, infamous for its ability to stretch the human body beyond endurance, symbolized the limitless reach of authority. Prisoners accused of heresy or treason felt their joints dislocate as ropes tightened with each turn of the wheel. More intimate was the thumbscrew, crushing bone and nail in a slow agony designed to loosen tongues. While these devices were not punishments in the strict sense but tools of interrogation, their use was often a punishment in itself, for many perished without confession. The narrative of the dungeon, echoing with screams, tells us that truth in the medieval world was not discovered, it was extracted. Equally strange was the chair of torture, a spiked seat upon which victims were forced to sit, sometimes with weights applied to their thighs to press the flesh deeper into the iron points. Though the victim might not die immediately, the pain was unrelenting, and the psychological terror immense. Each spike left a mark. Each moment seated was another reminder that justice could turn the simplest object into a weapon of control. Accounts describe prisoners trembling at the mere sight of the chair, their fear perhaps as effective as the pain itself in breaking resistance. In some regions, offenders were sewn into animal skins as a form of grotesque execution. Chronicles recount instances where criminals were bound within ox hides and left beneath the sun to suffocate and decay, their bodies merging with the stench of rot and leather. Such punishments carried symbolic weight, reducing the human offender to beastly status, stripping away dignity and humanity in one horrific gesture. The narrative power of such acts was immense, for the sight of a man dying as if he were no more than livestock burned deeply into communal memory. Other executions sought innovation in cruelty. Boiling alive was reserved for poisoners in certain parts of Europe, the bubbling cauldrons standing as grim reminders in market squares. The sound of flesh searing in liquid, the steam rising like twisted incense, created an unforgettable spectacle. Pressing to death, known as peine forte et dure, was another macabre practice in England. Those who refused to plead in court were laid on the ground, boards placed upon them, and stones piled higher and higher until their ribs cracked and life was squeezed from their bodies. The slowness of the death was the point. It was designed not only to punish, but to force submission, a terrifying negotiation between silence and survival. As with earlier punishments, these acts were more than mere cruelty. They were woven into the cultural fabric, signs that law was sacred, that order must be preserved through whatever means necessary. The blending of ritual, symbolism, and suffering reveals a society where punishment was not hidden away, but staged for all to see, where the extraordinary became everyday, and where even the most bizarre acts carried the weight of communal truth. This first half of the expanded exploration offers but a glimpse into the arsenal of strange punishments devised by the medieval imagination, punishments that spoke as much to fear and fascination as to justice itself. The strange catalogue of medieval punishments continued to grow as societies sought new ways to discipline, frighten, and impress upon their people the seriousness of law. With every passing century, Punishments became not merely acts of control but markers of identity, tools through which communities defined what it meant to belong or to stray beyond the pale of order. Among the peculiar devices of punishment was the brank, sometimes called the gossip's bridle. Similar to the scold's bridle, it was an iron framework that encased the head and forced a flat piece of metal or spiked plate into the mouth of the offender. Most often used on women accused of idle chatter, slander or nagging, the brank turns speech into agony. Picture a woman, her face reddened, iron cold against her skin, paraded through the streets while neighbours mocked her silence. The cruelty of the device lay not only in the physical pain, but in its symbolism, the very faculty of speech. The power to shape community through words was locked away as punishment. Such punishments highlight how medieval societies policed not only deeds but voices, controlling the narrative of daily life itself. Some punishments leaned heavily on psychological terror rather than immediate harm. The Iron Maiden, though its existence as a medieval device is debated, emerged in later accounts as a coffin-like sarcophagus lined with spikes. Victims supposedly enclosed within it would face the horror of impending death, whether or not the spikes were lethal. Even if myth more than reality, its endurance as a tale reflects the medieval fascination with enclosing the body in spaces of symbolic torment. To be sealed inside darkness, pierced or not, was to embody the fear of judgment and the loss of freedom in its most absolute form. Punishments could also take the form of enforced exposure. The cucking stool, sometimes reserved for women accused of scolding or prostitution, involved seating the offender in a chair fixed to a long wooden beam. The chair was then dunked into rivers or ponds, each plunge a public baptism of humiliation. Crowds gathered on bridges, their laughter echoing as the soaked victim gasped for breath. While some survived with dignity eroded, others drowned in what was meant as temporary punishment. The narrative of the cucking stool again reveals the blurring of punishment, entertainment, and lethal risk in medieval practice. Execution methods themselves varied with strange inventiveness. In parts of Europe, criminals were broken alive inside iron cages hung in public squares. Their bodies slowly wasted away, exposed to weather, hunger, and birds of prey. The cage became both a stage and a tomb, its slow decay a lesson written in bone and rusting iron. Elsewhere, flaying, peeling the skin from the body, was recorded as punishment for traitors or sacrilegious criminals. The sheer horror of the act, coupled with its public performance, turned the body into parchment upon which the law inscribed its ultimate warning. The narrative impact of such punishments resided not only in their cruelty, but in their memorability. They were stories destined to be retold for generations. Social punishments also carried a peculiar weight. To be shunned or declared unclean could mean as much as a physical sentence. Lepers, though victims of disease, often endured ritual exclusion, forced to carry clappers or bells announcing their presence, lest others be contaminated. This imposition transformed illness into punishment, stigmatizing the body as a vessel of moral failing. Similarly, debtors might be paraded with signs declaring their insolvency, their shame etched into communal memory long after coins were repaid. These punishments reveal that the medieval imagination understood reputation as fragile, and that dishonour could cut deeper than wounds. One of the more theatrical punishments was the practice of riding the stang. Offenders, often those accused of marital cruelty or dishonesty, were forced to straddle a wooden pole carried through the town on the shoulders of others. The offender, precariously balanced, became a living effigy, mocked and jostled while the crowd chanted verses about their misdeeds. The punishment turned private transgression into communal farce, ensuring that the memory of the act lingered long after the laughter faded. Like the charivari, it was punishment in the form of rough theatre, binding the community together against the one who had broken its trust. Not all punishments ended in death or lifelong shame. Some sought to humiliate in more absurd ways. Accounts exist of offenders being forced to crawl on hands and knees through town or to carry heavy stones until exhaustion overcame them. In one region, fraudulent bakers were made to eat their own undercooked bread in front of jeering crowds, a grim parody of communion. These punishments, though odd, reveal the ingenuity with which medieval societies matched crime to symbolic consequence, crafting justice that was both memorable and moralizing. Even burial could become punishment. The bodies of suicides were sometimes dragged through streets, buried at crossroads, or pierced with stakes to prevent their restless return. The act punished not only the dead, but their families, marking them with dishonour and excluding them from sacred ground. In this way, punishment extended beyond life, binding eternity itself into the fabric of law. The medieval world was also rife with regional peculiarities. In Scandinavia, thieves were sometimes tied to posts smeared with honey, left to the mercy of insects. In Italian city-states, elaborate parades of criminals through marketplaces dramatized civic order as much as they punished. In parts of Germany, those who refused military service could be forced to dig their own graves and then be symbolically buried as cowards before the community. These punishments remind us that justice was as much performance as principle, shaped by local customs and beliefs. As we conclude this expanded exploration, the panorama of strange punishments stands as a mirror to medieval society itself. Each punishment, whether dunking stool, iron cage, branding iron or barrel, reflected not only the crime but the community's imagination of order. Pain and humiliation were not incidental, they were the medium through which authority spoke, loud and clear, across centuries. The narrative thread running through these punishments is one of spectacle, symbolism, and the relentless intertwining of fear and faith. The medieval world, in its creativity and cruelty, made punishment a language, and every scar, laugh and gasp became part of its enduring vocabulary of control.